The emergency room at Mercy General Hospital had seen its share of chaos, but nothing quite like this Tuesday evening. The automatic doors burst open as the first ambulance arrived, followed quickly by 3 more. The paramedics rushed in with their gurneys, their faces grim and focused. 16 people had been shot in what the news would later call the deadliest mass shooting the city had experienced in decades. Dr. Sarah Chun stood at the center of the emergency department, coordinating the incoming patients with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra. Her scrubs were already stained with blood from the first wave of victims, and her dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun that showed the stress of the evening. She had been working as an emergency physician for 12 years, but nights like this still tested every ounce of her training and resolve. "We need Trauma Bay 3 prepped now," she called out to the nursing staff. "And get Dr. Martinez down here from surgery. We're going to need all hands." The hospital had activated its mass casualty protocol within minutes of receiving the first call. Extra staff had been called in, and the emergency department had been cleared of all non-critical patients. The waiting room, usually filled with people nursing minor injuries and illnesses, now housed the families of shooting victims, their faces etched with worry and fear. Among the medical team that had answered the emergency call was Marcus Thompson, a former Navy SEAL medic who now worked as a trauma nurse at Mercy General. At 34, Marcus carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen combat and lived to tell about it. His hands were steady, his voice calm, and his ability to work under pressure was legendary among his colleagues. But tonight, as he moved between the trauma bays, something felt different. The shooter had opened fire at the Riverside Community Center during a neighborhood meeting about local safety concerns. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. People had gathered to discuss making their communities safer, only to become victims of the very violence they were trying to prevent. The gunman had entered through the back door and fired indiscriminately into the crowd before being subdued by an off-duty police officer. Marcus worked on a middle-aged man who had been shot in the shoulder. The bullet had missed major arteries, and while the injury was serious, it wasn't life-threatening. As he cleaned the wound and prepared the patient for surgery, Marcus found his mind wandering to his own experiences with gunfire. The sounds of the trauma bay, the beeping monitors, the urgent voices, the controlled chaos, reminded him of field hospitals in Afghanistan where he had served 3 tours of duty. "How many more are coming in?" Marcus asked Dr. Chun as she passed by his station. 2 more ambulances," she replied, not slowing down. "1 critical, 1 stable." The doors opened again, and Marcus looked up to see the paramedics wheeling in their next patient. It was a woman, probably in her late 20s, with long brown hair matted with blood. She was conscious but clearly in shock, her eyes wide and unfocused. Marcus quickly moved to assist with her transfer to Trauma Bay 5. "What do we have?" Dr. Chun asked the paramedic. "Female, approximately 28 years old, gunshot wound to the left thigh, possible fracture." She was conscious at the scene, but became increasingly confused during transport. Blood pressure is dropping, pulse is elevated. As they moved the woman onto the hospital bed, Marcus began cutting away her clothing to assess her injuries. It was standard procedure, necessary to ensure there were no hidden wounds that could prove fatal. But as he worked, something caught his eye that made him pause. On the woman's left shoulder blade was a tattoo. It wasn't the tattoo itself that stopped him, but what it depicted. It was a military unit insignia that Marcus recognized immediately, the symbol of the 101st Airborne Division. Below, it were dates that corresponded to deployments in Afghanistan and Iraq. This wasn't just any civilian caught in a tragic shooting. This was a fellow veteran. Marcus's hands stilled for just a moment as he processed what he was seeing. In that brief pause, he noticed more. Scars on her arms that looked like they came from shrapnel. Another small tattoo on her wrist with coordinates that Marcus suspected marked a significant location from her military service. And there, barely visible beneath the blood and dirt, were the calloused hands of someone who had spent years handling weapons and equipment. Marcus, I need you focused. Dr. Chen's voice cut through his thoughts. What's her status? Entry wound on the left thigh. No exit wound visible. Possible femoral artery involvement. I'm getting pressure bandages on it now. Marcus's training kicked back in, but his mind was still processing the implications of what he had discovered. As he worked to stabilize her bleeding, Marcus found himself studying the woman's face more carefully. There was something familiar about her, something that nagged at the edges of his memory. Her features were strong, determined even in unconsciousness. She had the look of someone who had faced danger before and survived. The emergency room continued its frantic pace around them. Other victims were being treated in neighboring bays, and the sounds of medical equipment and urgent conversations filled the air. But Marcus felt increasingly focused on this one patient, this mystery soldier who had somehow ended up in his care. I need to get her up to surgery, Dar. Chen announced after examining the wound. The bullet is too close to the artery to risk waiting. As they prepared to move the woman to the operating room, she began to regain consciousness. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked around in confusion. When her gaze met Marcus's, he saw something there that confirmed his suspicions. These were the eyes of a combat veteran, someone who had seen action and knew the difference between safety and danger. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You're at Mercy General Hospital," Marcus told her, keeping his voice calm and reassuring. "You were hurt, but you're safe now. We're going to take good care of you." She tried to sit up, but Marcus gently held her down. "Easy there. You need to stay still. You've been shot, and we need to get you to surgery." "Shot?" The confusion in her eyes was genuine. "I don't remember. There was a meeting. People were screaming." "Don't worry about that now," Marcus said. "Just focus on staying calm. Everything's going to be okay." But as they wheeled her toward the elevator, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he knew this woman from somewhere. The military tattoos, the scars, the way she carried herself even while injured, it all pointed to someone with significant combat experience. And something about her face was triggering memories that he couldn't quite place. The elevator doors closed, and Marcus found himself riding up to the surgical floor with Dr. Chun and their patient. In a confined space, he got a better look at her other tattoos. There was one on her right forearm that showed the Army Combat Medical Badge. This woman wasn't just a veteran. She had been a medic just like him. "You served," Marcus said quietly, not really asking a question. She turned her head slightly to look at him, and for a moment, her eyes cleared. "Yeah, 3 tours. You. Navy. Afghanistan." A small smile crossed her face despite her pain. "Probably crossed paths at some point. Small world over there." The elevator reached the surgical floor, and they were immediately met by the surgical team. As they transferred her to the operating table, Marcus found himself reluctant to leave. There was still something about her that he couldn't identify, some memory that was just beyond his reach. "I'll be right here when you wake up," he promised her as the anesthesiologist prepared to put her under. "Thanks, Doc," she mumbled as the medication began to take effect. "What's your name?" "Marcus Thompson." "What's yours?" "Marina," she whispered just before the anesthesia claimed her. "Marina Rodriguez." The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Marina Rodriguez. Suddenly, the memories came flooding back with crystal clarity. The forward operating base in Afghanistan. The convoy that had been hit by an IED. The female medic who had crawled through enemy fire to reach the wounded. The soldier who had saved his life and the lives of 3 other men that day, even though she had been wounded herself. Marcus gripped the wall of the hallway as the full weight of recognition settled on him. Marina Rodriguez wasn't just any veteran medic. She was the medic who had earned a Bronze Star with valor for her actions that day in Afghanistan. She was the soldier whose quick thinking and incredible bravery had turned what could have been a massacre into a story of survival. And now, 4 years later, and thousands of miles from that dusty battlefield, she was lying on an operating table after being shot by some random gunman at a community meeting. The irony was overwhelming. A woman who had survived multiple combat deployments, who had faced down enemy fire to save others, had been wounded while attending a neighborhood safety meeting in her own hometown. Marcus stood in the hallway outside the operating room, still processing the incredible coincidence. He thought about that day in Afghanistan, about how Marina had appeared like an angel of mercy when everything seemed hopeless. He remembered the determined look on her face as she worked on the wounded despite her own injuries. He remembered how she had refused to be evacuated until every other casualty had been treated and transported. The surgery would take hours, and Marcus knew he should return to the emergency department where other patients needed his help. But something kept him rooted to that spot outside the operating room. After all these years, fate had brought Marina Rodriguez back into his life, and he wasn't about to walk away from that responsibility. He finally forced himself to return to the emergency department, where the last of the shooting victims were being treated. The chaos was beginning to subside as the most critical patients had been stabilized and sent to surgery. Dr. Chun looked exhausted, but satisfied as she updated him on the status of the remaining patients. "How's the female in trauma 5?" she asked. "In surgery. Should be okay, but it's going to be a long procedure." Marcus paused, then added, "Dr. Chun, that woman is someone I serve with in Afghanistan. She saved my life over there." Dr. Chun looked surprised. "Really? That's quite a coincidence." "Yeah, her name is Marina Rodriguez. She's a decorated combat medic. Bronze Star with Valor. Well then, she's in good hands with Dr. Martinez. He's one of our best surgeons." Dr. Chun put a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Why don't you take a break? You've been going nonstop for hours." Marcus nodded, but instead of going to the break room, he found himself walking to the surgical waiting area. He needed to be there when Marina came out of surgery. He needed to talk to her to find out what had happened to her since Afghanistan, to understand how a decorated war hero had ended up as a victim in a random shooting. The waiting room was filled with families of the shooting victims. Some were crying, others sat in stunned silence. The television in the corner was broadcasting news coverage of the shooting, showing footage of the community center and interviews with witnesses. Marcus watched for a few minutes, trying to piece together exactly what had happened. According to the news reports, the gunman had been a disgruntled former employee of the community center who had been fired several months earlier. He had entered the building during the neighborhood safety meeting and opened fire with a semi-automatic pistol. An off-duty police officer attending the meeting had been able to tackle the shooter and disarm him, but not before 16 people had been wounded. The news anchor mentioned that while the injuries ranged from minor to serious, there had been no fatalities. It was being called a miracle, given the number of people in the room and the amount of ammunition the gunman had been carrying. Marcus couldn't help but think that if Marina had been fully alert and uninjured, she might have been one of the people helping to subdue the gunman. That was just the kind of person she was. Hours passed as Marcus waited. He dozed fitfully in the uncomfortable waiting room chair, his mind drifting between the present and memories of Afghanistan. He thought about the day Marina had saved his life, about the other soldiers they had both known who hadn't made it home. He wondered what she had been doing since her discharge from the army, what had brought her to that community meeting. Finally, around 3 in the morning, Dr. Martinez emerged from the surgical suite. Marcus jumped to his feet, searching the surgeon's face for any indication of how the operation had gone. "She's going to be fine," Dr. Martinez said with a tired smile. "The bullet missed the femoral artery by about 2 millimeters. Any closer, and she would have bled out at the scene. We were able to remove the bullet and repair the muscle damage. She'll need physical therapy, but she should make a full recovery." Relief washed over Marcus like a wave. "When can I see her?" "She's being moved to recovery now. Give her an hour or so to wake up fully, then you can visit." Marcus thanked the surgeon and settled back into his chair to wait. Dawn was beginning to break outside the hospital windows, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. It had been one of the longest nights of his life, but Marina was going to be okay. That was all that mattered. As he waited for her to wake up, Marcus thought about what he would say to her. How do you greet someone who saved your life years ago in a war zone, only to find them wounded in a hospital in your hometown? How do you express gratitude for something that happened so long ago, but still felt immediate and urgent? The nurse finally came to get him just after sunrise. She's awake and asking for you, she said with a smile. Room 314. Marcus made his way to Marina's room, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. He paused outside her door, taking a deep breath before knocking softly and entering. Marina was lying in the hospital bed, looking pale, but alert. Her leg was elevated and wrapped in bandages, and there were various monitors attached to her arms. But her eyes were clear and focused, and when she saw Marcus, her face lit up with recognition and surprise. "Well, I'll be damned," she said, her voice still a little hoarse from the anesthesia. "Marcus Thompson, I knew I recognized you." Marcus approached the bed slowly, still hardly believing that he was really there with her. "Hello, Marina. It's good to see you again. I just wish it was under better circumstances." She laughed, a sound that was exactly as he remembered it from Afghanistan. "Yeah, getting shot at a neighborhood meeting wasn't exactly on my bucket list. But hey, at least I'm in good hands. How long have you been working here?" "About 2 years. I got out of the Navy and went back to school for nursing. Figured I'd put my medical training to good use in civilian life." Marcus pulled up a chair next to her bed. "What about you? What brings you to this part of the world?" Marina's expression grew more serious. "I moved here about a year ago. I was having some adjustment issues after my discharge. PTSD mostly. My therapist suggested a change of scenery might help. I got a job as a paramedic with the city, and I've been living in a neighborhood where the shooting happened." Marcus nodded, understanding completely. Many veterans struggled with the transition back to civilian life, especially those who had seen heavy combat. "How are you doing with all that?" "Better. The new job has been good for me. I like being able to help people again, you know? And the community here has been really welcoming. That's actually why I was at the meeting last night. I wanted to get more involved in local issues, maybe volunteer with some of the youth programs." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Marina had been trying to make her new community safer when she became a victim of violence herself. But Marcus could see in her eyes that this setback wouldn't defeat her. She had the same determined spirit that had carried her through 3 combat deployments. "I can't believe you're here," Marcus said, shaking his head in amazement. "After all these years, in a city of 500,000 people, you end up as my patient." Marina smiled. Maybe it's not such a coincidence. Maybe the universe has a plan. They talked for the next hour, catching up on the years since Afghanistan and sharing stories about their transitions to civilian life. Marcus learned that Marina had struggled more than most veterans with PTSD, partly because of her experiences as a medic. She had seen so much trauma and loss that it had taken her years to find peace with her memories. But she had found that peace, at least partially, through helping others. Her work as a paramedic had given her a sense of purpose similar to what she had felt in the military. She was making a difference in people's lives, using her skills to save and heal rather than to fight and destroy. As Marcus listened to her story, he felt a deep admiration for the woman lying in the hospital bed. She had survived combat, survived the difficult transition to civilian life, and was building a new future for herself through service to others. And now she would survive this random act of violence as well, because that's who Marina Rodriguez was. She was a survivor, a fighter, someone who refused to be defeated by circumstances beyond her control. The morning sun streamed through the hospital room window, casting warm light across Marina's face. Despite everything she had been through in the past 12 hours, she looked peaceful and determined. Marcus realized that seeing her again, knowing that she was safe and building a good life for herself, had answered questions about his own military service that he hadn't even known he was carrying. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" Marina asked. "For that day in Afghanistan. I never got the chance to properly thank you for what you did." Marina waved a hand dismissively. "We all did our jobs over there. We looked out for each other. No, it was more than that. You saved my life and the lives of 3 other soldiers. You risked everything to get to us, even though you were wounded yourself. That wasn't just doing your job. That was heroism. Tears filled Marina's eyes, and for a moment, the strong facade she had maintained throughout their conversation cracked slightly. I just did what anyone would have done. No, Marcus said firmly. You did what Marina Rodriguez would do, and that made all the difference. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in memories and grateful for this unexpected reunion. Outside, the city was waking up, beginning another day. The shooting would be front-page news, and the community would begin the long process of healing and recovery. But in room 314 of Mercy General Hospital, two old soldiers had found each other again, and that felt like a small miracle in itself. 3 days had passed since the shooting, and Marina Rodriguez found herself staring at the ceiling of her hospital room, counting the tiny holes in the acoustic tiles above her bed. The pain medication made her drowsy, but sleep remained elusive. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard the sharp crack of gunfire and saw the panicked faces of her neighbors as they dove for cover behind folding chairs and tables. The physical therapy session that morning had gone better than expected. Her leg was healing well, and Dr. Martinez was optimistic about her recovery timeline. But the physical wounds were only part of the battle Marina was fighting. The shooting had triggered something deeper, older memories that she thought she had successfully buried. Marcus had visited every day during his shifts, bringing coffee from the good cafe down the street and updates from the emergency department. His presence had become an anchor for Marina, a connection to someone who understood the weight of carrying memories from war. But today, she sensed something different in his demeanor when he knocked on her door. "Come in," she called, attempting to sit up straighter in the bed. Marcus entered carrying his usual coffee offering, but his expression was more serious than she had seen since that first night. Behind him was another man, older, with graying hair and the unmistakable bearing of someone who had spent decades in military service. "Marina, I'd like you to meet someone," Marcus said, setting the coffee on her bedside table. "This is Colonel James Patterson, retired Army. He was my commanding officer during my last deployment." Colonel Patterson stepped forward with a warm smile, but Marina could see the assessment in his eyes as he took in her appearance and obvious military bearing. "MS. Rodriguez, it's an honor to meet you. Marcus has told me quite a lot about your service record." Marina felt a familiar wariness creep up her spine. In her experience, when retired military officers sought out former enlisted personnel, it usually meant they wanted something. "Thank you, sir. Though I'm not sure what Marcus might have shared that would be of interest to you." The colonel pulled up one of the visitor chairs and sat down, his movements deliberate and respectful. "Actually, quite a lot. You see, I've been working on a project for the past 2 years, and I think you might be exactly the person I've been looking for." Marcus perched on the edge of the windowsill, his coffee cooling in his hands. Marina could see he was nervous about something, which only increased her own apprehension. "What kind of project?" she asked carefully. Colonel Patterson leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together. "I'm working with the Veterans Administration and several private foundations to develop a new type of support program for combat veterans dealing with PTSD and adjustment issues. But it's not your typical therapy program. We're looking for veterans with exceptional service records who have successfully navigated their own recovery to serve as peer counselors and mentors." Marina felt her defenses rising. "Sir, with all due respect, I don't think I'm the success story you're looking for. I spent 2 years after my discharge barely functional. I couldn't hold a job, couldn't maintain relationships, couldn't even leave my apartment some days." "I know," the colonel said quietly. "Marcus shared some of your story with me, with your permission to discuss it generally. But that's exactly why you'd be perfect for this program. You've been where these other veterans are now. You understand the darkness they're fighting, but you've also found your way out of it." Marina looked over at Marcus, who nodded encouragingly. "I told him about your work as a paramedic, about how you've rebuilt your life here. He's not looking for someone who never struggled, Marina. He's looking for someone who struggled and survived." The colonel reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. "I'd like to share something with you, if you're willing to listen." It's about a young soldier named David Chun. He's 23 years old, served 2 tours in Afghanistan as an infantryman. He came home 8 months ago, and he's been in and out of VA hospitals ever since. He opened the folder and showed Marina a photograph of a young Asian American man in military dress uniform. His smile was bright and confident, the look of someone who believed he was invincible. But Marina recognized something else in his eyes, something she had seen in her own mirror during her darkest days. David saved the lives of 4 fellow soldiers when their patrol was ambushed outside Kandahar. The colonel continued. He carried them one by one to safety under heavy enemy fire. He was awarded the Silver Star for his actions. Marina studied the photograph more closely. Let me guess. He doesn't feel like a hero. He feels guilty for surviving when others didn't. He wakes up every night reliving that ambush, wondering if he could have done more, moved faster, been better. The colonel's expression grew somber. 3 weeks ago, David was found in his apartment by his roommate. He had swallowed most of a bottle of sleeping pills. The only reason he's alive is because his roommate came home early from work. The words hit Marina like a physical blow. She had been in David's place, standing at that precipice where the pain of living seemed greater than the fear of dying. She remembered the night she had stood on the balcony of her apartment, 12 stories up, wondering if anyone would even notice if she disappeared. What stopped him? She asked quietly. The same thing that probably stopped you, Marcus said from his position by the window. The part of him that still remembers what it feels like to save lives instead of taking them. Colonel Patterson nodded. David is currently in a residential treatment facility, but he's not responding well to traditional therapy approaches. The counselors are well-meaning, but they've never been in combat. They can't relate to what he's experiencing in a way that matters to him. Marina set the photograph down on her bedside table, but she kept looking at it. You think I can reach him because I've been where he is. I think you can reach him because you chose to live, the colonel replied. And more than that, you chose to rebuild your life in service to others. You found a way to channel your warrior instincts into healing rather than destruction. The room fell silent for several minutes as Marina considered the colonel's words. She thought about her own journey through the valley of PTSD, about the therapists and counselors who had tried to help her but couldn't understand the weight of military service. She remembered the turning point in her recovery, when she had finally found a counselor who was also a veteran, someone who understood that healing from combat trauma required more than just talking about feelings. Where is David now? She finally asked. Pine Ridge Veterans Treatment Center, about an hour north of here. It's a private facility that specializes in combat PTSD cases. They've agreed to let us bring in peer counselors to supplement their traditional therapy programs. Marina looked over at Marcus, who was watching her with an expression of hope mixed with concern. She knew he was worried about her taking on too much too soon after the shooting. But she also knew he understood her need to find meaning in her suffering. What would my role be exactly? She asked. Colonel Patterson smiled for the first time since entering the room. Initially, just talking with David and a few other veterans who were struggling. Sharing your story, listening to theirs. Helping them understand that recovery is possible, that they're not alone in their experiences. And later, if the program is successful, we'd like to expand it. Train peer counselors like yourself to work with newly discharged veterans. Help them transition more smoothly into civilian life. Maybe prevent some of them from reaching the crisis point that David and others have reached. Marina thought about her paramedic work, about the satisfaction she found in responding to emergency calls and helping people in their worst moments. This would be similar, but focused specifically on her fellow veterans. It would be a way to use her military experience and her recovery journey to serve others who had served their country. Can I think about it? She asked. Of course, the colonel said, standing up from his chair. Take all the time you need. I'll leave my contact information with Marcus. When you're ready, whether it's next week or next month, just give me a call. After the colonel left, Marcus remained in the room, finishing his coffee in contemplative silence. Marina could tell he had something more to say, but he seemed to be struggling with how to express it. "What's on your mind?" she finally asked. Marcus set down his coffee cup and moved to sit in the chair the colonel had vacated. "I've been thinking a lot about Afghanistan lately. About that day you saved us." Marina tensed slightly. She had learned during her therapy that while talking about combat experiences was necessary for healing, it had to be done carefully and at the right time. "What about it?" "I never told you the whole story of what happened after you got us to the evac site," Marcus said. "While you were being treated for your wounds, the rest of us were debriefed by our commanding officer. He told us that the intelligence that led to our patrol being in that location was faulty. We weren't supposed to be there." Marina felt a familiar tightness in her chest. "Go on." "The mission we were on, the one that got us ambushed, it was based on information from a source who turned out to be compromised. The enemy knew we were coming. They had time to set up that ambush specifically for us." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Marina had always assumed the ambush was just bad luck, being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Learning that it had been a deliberate trap, that they had been set up, added a new layer of betrayal to memories she thought she had processed. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. Marcus leaned forward, his hands clasped together much like the colonel's had been. "Because I think you've been carrying guilt that doesn't belong to you. You've been wondering if you could have done more, moved faster, saved more people. But the truth is we never should have been in that situation in the first place. The fact that any of us survived that ambush is a miracle, and it's a miracle that happened because of your actions." Marina felt tears forming in her eyes, and she didn't try to stop them. For years, she had replayed that day over and over in her mind, analyzing every decision she had made, wondering if she could have somehow prevented the casualties they had suffered. "Johnson and Martinez," she whispered, naming the two soldiers who hadn't made it home from that patrol, "died because someone in intelligence screwed up, not because you didn't do enough," Marcus said firmly. "You saved 4 lives that day, Marina. For soldiers who went home to their families because you were brave enough to crawl through enemy fire to reach us." The tears were flowing freely now, and Marina didn't care. These were tears she had needed to shed for years, grief that had been mixed with guilt and self-recrimination. Hearing Marcus's words, understanding that the mission itself had been compromised, helped her separate her own actions from the larger tragedy of war. "I still see their faces," she admitted. "Johnson and Martinez. I dream about them sometimes." "So do I," Marcus replied. "But I also dream about going home to my family, about the life I've been able to build because you gave me the chance to live it. That's the other side of the equation, Marina. The lives that continued because of what you did." They sat together in the hospital room as the afternoon sun streamed through the windows. Two veterans finally, sharing the complete truth about a day that had defined both their lives. Marina felt something shifting inside her, a loosening of the tight knot of guilt and regret she had carried for so long. "Tell me more about David," she said eventually. Marcus smiled, recognizing the significance of her question. "He's from California. Joined the Army right out of high school. His parents are both doctors, and they don't understand why he can't just get over his experiences and move on with his life." "Classic," Marina said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Families want to help, but they have no frame of reference for what combat does to someone." "Exactly. He feels isolated from everyone he used to be close to. The only people who really understand him are other veterans, but he's been avoiding veteran support groups because he says they just sit around talking about the war, and he wants to move forward, not backward." Marina nodded, remembering her own resistance to traditional veteran support groups early in her recovery. "He wants to heal, but he doesn't want to relive the trauma over and over again." "That's where you come in," Marcus said. "You're someone who can show him that healing is possible without constantly rehashing the worst moments. You've built a new life that honors your military experience without being defined by it." Marina looked again at David's photograph, studying the confident young face that masked so much pain and confusion. She thought about her own journey from that broken veteran who couldn't function in civilian society to the paramedic who had been attending a community meeting to make her neighborhood safer. "When can I meet him?" she asked. Marcus's smile widened. "I'll call Colonel Patterson and set something up for next week, after you're discharged." As visiting hours drew to a close and Marcus prepared to leave, Marina felt a sense of anticipation she hadn't experienced in years. The shooting that had brought her to this hospital room had been a random act of violence that could have destroyed her carefully rebuilt life. Instead, it had reconnected her with Marcus and opened a door to a new way of serving her fellow veterans. She thought about the community meeting she had attended, about her desire to get more involved in making her neighborhood safer. This opportunity with the Veteran Support Program felt like a natural extension of that impulse, a way to make not just her immediate community safer, but the larger community of veterans who were struggling to find their place in civilian society. That night, as Marina lay in her hospital bed, listening to the familiar sounds of a medical facility, she felt more at peace than she had in months. The shooting had triggered difficult memories and forced her to confront aspects of her PTSD that she thought she had overcome. But it had also led her to this moment, to the possibility of using her experiences to help other veterans find their way back from the edge of despair. She thought about David Chun, about the young soldier who had saved 4 lives and couldn't understand why that made him a hero instead of just a survivor. She thought about the conversation she would have with him, about the way she might help him understand that survival was its own form of courage, that choosing to live and heal and build something meaningful from trauma was perhaps the greatest victory of all. The next morning brought new visitors to Marina's room. Her physical therapy team arrived early, eager to continue working on her mobility and strength. Dr. Martinez stopped by during his rounds to check on her surgical site and discuss her discharge plans. But the visit that surprised her most came from an unexpected source. Officer Janet Williams, the off-duty police officer who had tackled the gunman at the community meeting, knocked softly on Marina's door around midday. She was a woman in her early 40s with short blonde hair and the kind of alert, assessing gaze that Marina recognized in fellow first responders. "Ms. Rodriguez? I'm Officer Williams. I was at the community meeting the other night." Marina gestured for her to come in, curious about what had brought the officer to visit her. "Please, call me Marina. And thank you for what you did that night. You saved a lot of lives." Officer Williams shook her head as she sat down. "I should be thanking you. And not just for that night." Marina looked confused. "I don't understand." "I've been a police officer for 18 years, Officer Williams explained. "I've seen a lot of traumatic situations, responded to countless emergencies. But I've never seen anyone respond to a crisis the way you did the other night." "I don't remember much of what happened," Marina admitted. "The shooting, people screaming, and then waking up here." Officer Williams leaned forward, her expression earnest. "You were shot in the leg, but instead of staying down or trying to get to safety, you immediately started helping other victims. Even wounded, you were applying pressure to wounds, talking people through their panic, organizing the uninjured to help the injured." Marina felt a flush of embarrassment. "That's just training. Military medical training. It's automatic." "Maybe, but it was also incredibly brave. And more than that, it was effective. The paramedics who responded to the scene told me that the preliminary first aid provided by someone at the scene probably prevented at least 2 of the victims from bleeding out before they could get to the hospital." The words hit Marina with unexpected force. She had spent so much time since her discharge from the Army feeling like her military skills were irrelevant in civilian life, like she was struggling to find ways to be useful and productive. Learning that those skills had made a difference during the shooting, that her training had helped save lives even as she was becoming a victim herself, gave her a sense of validation she hadn't realized she needed. "I wish I could remember more of it," she said. "Trauma has a way of fracturing memories," Officer Williams replied. "But I wanted you to know that your actions that night made my job easier and probably saved lives. You should be proud of how you responded." After Officer Williams left, Marina found herself thinking about the gap between her memory of the shooting and the reality that others had witnessed. She remembered the terror and confusion the sound of gunfire, and screaming. But she had no conscious memory of helping other victims or applying first aid to their wounds. It reminded her of stories she had heard from other combat veterans, soldiers who had performed acts of heroism during firefights, but couldn't remember the specific details of their actions afterward. The body and mind sometimes took over during extreme stress, falling back on training and instinct while conscious thought took a back seat to survival. The realization that she had automatically reverted to her medic training during the shooting, even while wounded herself, felt like a bridge between her military past and her civilian future. It showed her that the skills and instincts she had developed during her Army service weren't just relics of a previous life, but integral parts of who she was and who she was becoming. That afternoon, as she worked with the physical therapist on strengthening exercises for her injured leg, Marina found herself thinking about David Shunn and the other veterans she might be able to help through Colonel Patterson's program. She thought about the ways trauma could shatter a person's sense of purpose and identity, and the importance of finding new ways to channel old skills and training into meaningful work. By the time Marcus arrived for his evening visit, Marina had made her decision. "I want to do it," she said as soon as he walked through the door. "The program with Colonel Patterson. I want to meet David and see if I can help." Marcus smiled, but she could see a hint of concern in his eyes. "Are you sure? You've been through a lot this week. No one would blame you for wanting to focus on your own recovery for a while." Marina shook her head. "This is part of my recovery. I spent too long thinking about what I lost in the war, what I couldn't do anymore because of my PTSD. Today I learned that I helped save lives during the shooting, even though I was wounded and don't remember doing it. That tells me that who I am as a veteran, as a former combat medic, is still a vital part of who I'm becoming as a civilian." Marcus nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his expression. "You need to know that your service still matters, that your experiences still have value." "Exactly. And maybe by helping David and other veterans like him, I can finally find a way to honor the memories of Johnson and Martinez, to make sure their sacrifice meant something." As they talked about the practical details of getting involved with the program, Marina felt a sense of excitement and purpose building inside her. The shooting had been a traumatic setback, but it had also been a reminder of her own strength and resilience. More importantly, it had connected her with Marcus again and opened a door to a new way of serving others. She looked forward to meeting David Shunn, to sharing her story of struggle and recovery, and to helping him understand that healing was not just possible, but achievable. She thought about the young soldier who had saved 4 lives and couldn't see past his own trauma to recognize his own heroism. Soon, she would help him understand that surviving and healing were their own forms of courage, and that the choice to live and serve and heal was perhaps the greatest victory any veteran could achieve. The Pine Ridge Veterans Treatment Center sat nestled among tall pine trees about an hour north of the city, its modern buildings designed to blend harmoniously with the natural landscape. Marina Rodriguez drove through the entrance gates on a crisp morning 2 weeks after her discharge from the hospital, her legs still stiff but functional enough for her to navigate the walking paths of the facility. Colonel Patterson met her in the visitor parking area, his greeting warm but tinged with the nervous energy of someone who had invested significant hope in this meeting. Beside him stood Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the facility's chief psychiatrist, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the patient demeanor of someone who had spent decades working with trauma victims. "Marina, thank you for coming," Colonel Patterson said as they shook hands. "How are you feeling?" "Better every day," Marina replied, though she could feel the familiar tightness in her chest that always accompanied new situations involving her military service. "Ready to meet David." Dr. Mitchell stepped forward with a professional smile. "David is waiting for us in the common area. I should prepare you for what you're going to see. He's made some progress since his suicide attempt, but he's still very withdrawn. He agreed to this meeting, but he's skeptical about whether it will help." They walked through the facility's main building, past comfortable seating areas, and art therapy rooms. Marina noticed how different this place felt from the VA hospitals she had visited during her own treatment. The atmosphere here was more like a retreat center than a medical facility, with large windows that let in natural light and artwork created by the residents displayed throughout the hallways. David's primary issues are survivor guilt and a sense of disconnection from civilian life, Dr. Mitchell explained as they walked. He's intelligent and articulate when he chooses to engage, but he's built significant walls around himself. Traditional therapy has helped him develop coping mechanisms for his PTSD symptoms, but we haven't been able to break through his fundamental belief that he doesn't deserve to recover. Marina nodded, recognizing the mindset Dr. Mitchell was describing. She had spent months in her own recovery, believing that healing would somehow dishonor the memory of the soldiers who hadn't made it home. It was a form of survivor guilt that was particularly common among decorated veterans who had performed heroically under fire. They found David Chun sitting alone in a sunny corner of the common room, staring out a large window at the pine trees beyond. He was smaller than Marina had expected from his photograph, with the lean build of someone who had been athletic but was now struggling to maintain basic self-care routines. When he turned to look at them, Marina saw immediately what Dr. Mitchell had meant about his withdrawal. His eyes held the flat, distant expression of someone who had pulled so far inside himself that connecting with the outside world required enormous effort. "David, this is Marina Rodriguez, the veteran I told you about," Dr. Mitchell said gently. "Marina, David Chun." David stood politely and extended his hand, but Marina could see the lack of genuine engagement in the gesture. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice carrying the automatic respect that military training had ingrained in him. "Just Marina," she replied, accepting his handshake and noting the calloused hands that still bore the marks of military service. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Colonel Patterson and Dr. Mitchell exchanged glances, and Marina recognized their signal that they intended to leave her alone with David. It was the right approach, she thought. Whatever conversation she needed to have with this young veteran would happen more naturally without observers. "We'll be in Dr. Mitchell's office if you need anything," the colonel said. "Take as much time as you need." After they left, Marina and David settled into comfortable chairs positioned to take advantage of the natural light from the windows. For several minutes, they sat in silence, each assessing the other. Marina had learned during her own therapy that silence could be as valuable as words in building trust and connection. "They told me you were a medic," David finally said, not looking directly at her. "3 tours in Afghanistan," Marina confirmed. "Attached to different units at different times. Infantry mostly." "I was infantry too." "Second tour, we worked with some medics who were really good at their jobs." David's voice carried a note of respect, mixed with something that might have been pain. Marina recognized the careful way he had stopped himself from saying more. Veterans often had complicated relationships with the medical personnel who had treated them or their fellow soldiers. Sometimes the medics represented hope and salvation. Sometimes they represented the trauma of watching friends die despite everyone's best efforts. "Where were you stationed?" Marina asked, keeping her tone conversational rather than clinical. "Kandahar province, mostly. Some time in Helmand." David glanced at her briefly, then returned his gaze to the window. "You, all over. FOB Shank, FOB Salerno, spent some time at the Roll 3 hospital in Kandahar." Marina watched his face carefully as she mentioned the locations, seeing recognition and memory flicker in his expression. "I was at Salerno for about 6 months, David said, and for the first time, his voice held a note of genuine interest. "Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion." Marina felt a spark of recognition. "I was attached to Alpha Company for a part of my second tour." "When were you there?" "Spring of 2019 through fall." David turned to look at her directly for the first time. "Wait, were you the medic who—" "There was a female medic who worked with us on some of the longer patrols." "Probably. I did a lot of patrol work that deployment." Marina felt the familiar tightness in her chest as memories from that time began to surface. Do you remember a mission in late September? Convoy got hit by an IED about 10 clicks south of the base. David's entire demeanor changed, his body tensing as if preparing for a physical blow. You were there, he said, and it wasn't a question. Marina nodded slowly. I was in the lead vehicle. We lost 2 soldiers that day. Johnson and Martinez, David whispered, and Marina felt her heart stop. You knew them? Johnson was my squad leader. Martinez was my best friend. David's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, and Marina could see his hands beginning to shake slightly. I was supposed to be on that convoy. The words hung between them like a live wire, crackling with emotional energy. Marina felt the careful boundaries she had built around her memories of that day beginning to crumble as she realized the full scope of the connection between them. Why weren't you? She asked gently. David's eyes filled with tears that he seemed determined not to shed. I had food poisoning. Spent 2 days in the medical bay. Johnson took Rodriguez from 2nd Squad to fill my spot. He paused, struggling with the words. Rodriguez made a home. He lost his leg, but he made a home. Marina felt the room spinning slightly as the implications of David's story settled over her. This young man hadn't just lost fellow soldiers in combat. He had lost his best friend and squad leader on a mission he was supposed to have been part of, a mission where his presence might have changed the outcome. You've been carrying guilt about that day for almost 5 years, she said, understanding now why traditional therapy hadn't been able to reach him. I should have been there, David said, his voice breaking. If I hadn't gotten sick, if I had been on that convoy, maybe things would have gone differently. Maybe I could have saved them. Marina leaned forward in her chair, her own emotions threatening to overwhelm her professional composure. David, I need to tell you something about that day. Something that might be difficult to hear, but something you need to know. David wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and nodded. The mission that Convoy was on was based on compromised intelligence, Marina said carefully. We weren't supposed to be in that location. The enemy knew we were coming. They had time to set up that ambush specifically for us. David stared at her in shock. What do you mean? I mean that Convoy was walking into a trap from the moment it left base. The IED that hit us was just the beginning. There were enemy fighters positioned on both sides of the road, ready to hit us with everything they had. Marina paused, watching David's face as he processed this information. If you had been on that convoy, you would have died with Johnson and Martinez. Your presence wouldn't have changed the outcome of the ambush. But I could have tried. I could have done something. You would have done exactly what every other soldier on that convoy did, Marina said firmly. You would have fought back, you would have tried to help the wounded, and you would have either died or survived based on factors completely beyond your control. David buried his face in his hands, and Marina could see his shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. She gave him several minutes to process what she had told him before continuing. David, I was the medic on that convoy. I was responsible for treating the casualties, for trying to save Johnson and Martinez. Do you want to know what I learned about that day? He looked up at her, his eyes red, but focused. I learned that sometimes soldiers die not because their medics aren't good enough, or because their squad mates aren't brave enough, or because someone made a mistake. Sometimes soldiers die because war is chaos and violence and random chance. Johnson and Martinez died because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, walking into a trap that someone else had set for them. Marina felt her own tears starting to fall, but she didn't try to stop them. For 3 years after that day, I believed I should have been able to save them. I replayed every second of that firefight, wondering what I could have done differently. It wasn't until recently that I learned the truth about the compromised intelligence, about how we had been set up from the beginning. How did you deal with it? David asked quietly. How did you stop feeling like it was your fault? I had to learn to separate what I could control from what I couldn't control, Marina said. I could control how quickly I responded to casualties, how well I applied my medical training, how effectively I communicated with the evacuation teams. But I couldn't control the intelligence that put us in that location. I couldn't control the enemy's tactics, and I couldn't control the randomness of who lived and who died. David nodded slowly, but Marina could see he was still struggling with the concept. Let me ask you something, she continued. Tell me about the action that earned you your silver star. David's expression immediately became uncomfortable. I don't like talking about that. Why not? Because people always act like I did something special, something heroic. But I just did what anyone would have done. Marina smiled sadly, recognizing her own words from conversations with Marcus. Tell me what happened anyway. David sighed and stared out the window for a long moment before speaking. My squad was on patrol in a village outside Kandahar. We were doing a routine check of a market area when we got hit by sniper fire and RPGs. The enemy had us pinned down behind some concrete barriers, and I could see that 3 of my guys were wounded and couldn't move to cover on their own. So what did you do? I went back for them. Made 4 trips total. Carried each one of them to safety while the enemy was still shooting at us. That doesn't sound like what anyone would have done, Marina observed. That sounds like what a very brave soldier chose to do despite enormous personal risk. David shook his head. I just couldn't leave them there. Exactly, Marina said. You couldn't leave them there, even though staying in cover would have been safer for you. You chose to risk your own life to save theirs. That's the definition of heroism, David. But they gave me a medal for it, like it was some kind of achievement. Meanwhile, Johnson and Martinez are dead, and I wasn't even there to try to help them. Marina leaned back in her chair, beginning to understand the full scope of David's psychological struggle. He was trapped between conflicting emotions about his military service, pride in his heroic actions versus guilt over his survival, recognition for his bravery versus grief over his losses. David, can I tell you something that might sound strange? He nodded. I think Johnson will be proud of you for earning that silver star. David looked at her in surprise. What do you mean? I mean that you honored his training and his leadership by becoming the kind of soldier who would risk everything to save his fellow soldiers. You carried forward the values he taught you, and you used them to save lives. I never thought about it that way. Most veterans don't, Marina admitted. We get so focused on our failures and losses that we forget to see how our service honored those who came before us. Johnson trained you to be a good soldier, and you proved his training was effective by saving 4 lives under fire. They sat in silence for several minutes, both lost in their own thoughts and memories. Marina could see that David was beginning to process the conversation in a new way, but she also knew that changing thought patterns that had been entrenched for years would take time and continued work. How are you doing now? David finally asked. I mean, really doing, not just what you tell the doctors. Marina considered the question carefully. Some days are better than others. I still have nightmares sometimes. I still see Johnson and Martinez in my dreams. But I've learned to live with those memories instead of being controlled by them. Ow! I found ways to channel my military training into helping people in civilian life. I work as a paramedic now, so I'm still using my medical skills to save lives. And I'm starting to work with other veterans like you who are struggling with similar issues. David looked interested for the first time since their conversation had begun. You think it helps? Working with other veterans. I think it helps to know that you're not alone in what you're experiencing. And I think it helps to find ways to use your military skills and training in positive ways instead of just seeing them as reminders of trauma. The doctors here keep talking about reintegrating into civilian life, like I need to just forget about being a soldier and become someone completely different. Marina nodded, understanding his frustration. That's not how it works, though. You can't just erase 8 years of military service and pretend it didn't happen. The goal isn't to forget that you were a soldier. The goal is to figure out how to be a veteran. What's the difference? A soldier is someone who's currently serving, whose primary identity is defined by military service. A veteran is someone who has served and now gets to choose how that service fits into the rest of their life. David seemed to consider this distinction carefully. So, you're saying I get to decide what being a veteran means for me? Within reason, yes. You get to decide how your military experience informs your civilian life, how your training and skills can be used to serve your community, how your values as a soldier translate into values as a civilian. That's not what I expected you to say. Marina smiled. What did you expect? I expected you to tell me I needed to move on, put the past behind me, focus on building a new life that has nothing to do with the military. That's what a lot of people think recovery means. But I've learned that real recovery means integration, not separation. It means finding ways to honor your military service while also building a meaningful civilian life. David was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the pine trees. Marina could see him processing not just their conversation, but years of accumulated pain and confusion. Finally, he turned back to her with an expression that held the first hint of hope she had seen since meeting him. Would you come back and talk with me again? He asked. If you want me to, absolutely. And maybe you could tell me more about Johnson and Martinez, about what they were like on that convoy, what they were talking about, what they were thinking about. Marina felt a lump forming in her throat, but she nodded. I'd be honored to share those memories with you. As their time together drew to a close, Marina felt a sense of cautious optimism about David's potential for recovery. She could see that their shared connection to Johnson and Martinez had created a bridge between them, a foundation of trust that might allow for real healing to begin. When Colonel Patterson and Dr. Mitchell returned to check on them, they found David and Marina sitting together in comfortable silence, both looking out the window at the peaceful forest beyond. How did it go? Dr. Mitchell asked gently. David looked at Marina before answering. Better than I expected. We found out we have some shared experiences. Good, the colonel said. Marina, would you be willing to meet with David again next week? Already arranged, Marina replied. And, Colonel, I think I'd like to meet with some of the other veterans in your program as well. As they prepared to leave, David walked with them to the parking area. For the first time since Marina had met him, he seemed genuinely engaged with his surroundings, asking questions about her work as a paramedic and her own recovery process. Marina, he said as she reached her car, thank you for telling me about the intelligence being compromised. It doesn't make losing Johnson and Martinez any easier, but it helps to know that there was nothing any of us could have done to change what happened. Marina nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. David, I want you to think about something between now and next week. What's that? Johnson trained you to be a soldier, and you honored that training by saving 4 lives under fire. Now you have the opportunity to honor his memory by learning how to be the kind of veteran he would be proud of. David's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they seemed to be tears of recognition rather than despair. I think I'd like that. As Marina drove away from Pine Ridge Veterans Treatment Center, she felt a profound sense of gratitude for the unexpected turns her life had taken. The shooting that had brought her to the hospital where she reunited with Marcus had led her to this moment, to this opportunity to help a fellow veteran find his way back from the edge of despair. She thought about David's question about how to be a veteran rather than just a former soldier. It was a question she was still answering for herself, but one that she felt more equipped to address now that she understood her role in helping others navigate the same journey. The drive back to the city gave her time to process the emotional intensity of meeting David and learning about his connection to Johnson and Martinez. It felt like a circle closing, like a part of her own healing process that she hadn't even known was incomplete. That evening, as she called Colonel Patterson to discuss her continued involvement with the program, Marina felt a sense of purpose that she hadn't experienced since her discharge from the Army. She was ready to help other veterans understand that survival was its own form of heroism, and that choosing to heal and serve and honor fallen comrades through meaningful civilian life was perhaps the greatest victory any of them could achieve. 6 months after the shooting at the Riverside Community Center, Marina Rodriguez stood before a packed auditorium at the Pine Ridge Veterans Treatment Center. The room was filled with veterans, their families, medical staff, and community members who had gathered for the first graduation ceremony of the Peer Support Veteran Counselor Program. Behind her on the stage sat 12 graduates, including David Shun, who had not only completed his recovery program, but had also earned certification as a peer counselor. His transformation over the past months had been remarkable, not just in his physical appearance, but in the quiet confidence and sense of purpose that now radiated from him. Marina looked out at the audience, her eyes finding familiar faces scattered throughout the crowd. Marcus Thompson sat in the third row, having taken time off from his nursing shift to attend the ceremony. Colonel Patterson occupied a seat in the front row, his expression one of pride and satisfaction. Dr. Mitchell sat with her clinical staff, many of whom had initially been skeptical of the peer counseling approach but had become strong advocates after seeing the results. When I first came to Pine Ridge 6 months ago, Marina began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium sound system. I thought I was here to help one young veteran work through his trauma. What I discovered was that in helping David, I was completing my own healing journey in ways I never expected. She paused to look back at David, who gave her an encouraging nod. Their working relationship had evolved into a deep friendship built on mutual respect and shared understanding of the challenges facing combat veterans in civilian life. The traditional approach to treating veteran PTSD focuses on managing symptoms and coping with trauma, Marina continued. Those approaches are important and necessary, but they're not always sufficient. Sometimes healing requires more than just processing past experiences. Sometimes it requires finding new ways to serve, new ways to honor the sacrifices of those who didn't come home, and new ways to channel our military training into meaningful civilian purpose. In the audience, she spotted several faces that had become familiar over the months of the program's development. Sarah Kim, a former Army nurse who had struggled with alcoholism after her discharge, now worked as a substance abuse counselor at a local veterans clinic. James Morrison, a Marine veteran who had spent years homeless after returning from Iraq, had recently been hired as an outreach coordinator for a veterans housing program. Each of the graduates had their own story of struggle and recovery, their own journey from the darkness of untreated trauma to the light of renewed purpose. But they all shared one common experience. They had found healing not just in talking about their trauma, but in using their experiences to help other veterans facing similar challenges. The veteran sitting behind me on this stage represents something powerful, Marina said. They represent the truth that our military service doesn't end when we take off the uniform. They represent the possibility that our experiences in war, even the most difficult and traumatic ones, can be transformed into tools for healing and service. David Chin stood up from his chair on the stage and approached the podium. Marina stepped aside to give him space, knowing that this moment was particularly significant for him. 6 months earlier, he had been unable to see beyond his own trauma and guilt. Now, he was preparing to address a room full of people about hope and recovery. "My name is David Chun," he began, his voice steady and clear. 6 months ago, I was in this facility as a patient who had attempted suicide because I couldn't see a way forward from my combat experiences. Today, I'm here as a certified peer counselor who has already begun working with 3 other veterans who are starting their own recovery journeys. David paused to look back at Marina, his expression one of gratitude and respect. The difference between 6 months ago and today isn't that my trauma has disappeared or that I no longer grieve for the soldiers I lost in Afghanistan. The difference is that I've learned how to carry those experiences in a way that honors my fallen comrades, while also allowing me to build a meaningful life in service to others. The audience was completely silent, hanging on David's every word. Marina could see tears in the eyes of several family members, people who had watched their loved ones struggle with the invisible wounds of war and had almost given up hope for recovery. My best friend and squad leader were killed in an IED attack that I was supposed to be part of, David continued. For years, I believed that surviving when they didn't was a betrayal, that healing from my trauma would somehow dishonor their memory. Marina helped me understand that the opposite is true. The best way I can honor Johnson and Martinez is by becoming the kind of veteran they would be proud of. David's voice grew stronger as he spoke, his military bearing becoming more apparent as his confidence increased. The skills we learned in the military, leadership, teamwork, dedication to mission, willingness to sacrifice for others. These don't become obsolete when we return to civilian life. They become the foundation for a different kind of service, a different kind of mission. He gestured toward his fellow graduates. Every person on this stage has found a way to transform their military experience into civilian purpose. Sarah uses her medical training to help veterans struggling with addiction. James uses his understanding of homelessness to connect veterans with housing resources. Maria uses her intelligence background to work with law enforcement on veteran crisis intervention. Marina watched the audience's reaction to David's words, seeing recognition and hope dawning on faces throughout the room. These are family members who had felt helpless watching their loved one struggle. These were veterans who had wondered if recovery was possible. These were medical professionals who had searched for new approaches to treatment. The peer support model works, David said, because it's based on the same principles that made us effective soldiers. We take care of each other, we don't leave anyone behind, and we adapt and overcome whatever challenges we face. When David finished speaking and returned to his seat, the applause was sustained and emotional. Marina returned to the podium for her closing remarks, feeling a profound sense of accomplishment and gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this moment. Over the next year, she announced, we will be expanding the peer support program to 3 additional treatment facilities. We will also be launching a community outreach initiative to work with newly discharged veterans before they reach crisis points. Our goal is to create a network of veteran peer counselors who can provide support and guidance to their fellow veterans throughout their transition to civilian life. After the formal ceremony concluded, the graduates and their families gathered in the facility's common areas for reception. Marina moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and answering questions about the program's future plans. But the conversation that meant the most to her came from an unexpected source. Rebecca Johnson, an older woman with graying hair and kind eyes, approached Marina during a quiet moment near the windows overlooking the pine trees. Ms. Rodriguez, the woman said quietly, "My name is Rebecca Johnson. I believe you knew my son." Marina's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the name. "Your son was Staff Sergeant Michael Johnson." "Yes," Rebecca replied, her eyes filling with tears. "He was killed in Afghanistan almost 5 years ago." Marina felt the familiar tightness in her chest that always accompanied conversations about Johnson and Martinez. "Mrs. Johnson, I am so sorry for your loss. Your son was an exceptional soldier and a good man. He saved the lives of several soldiers under his command during his deployment." "I know," Rebecca said. "I received letters from some of the soldiers he served with. But I wanted to meet you specifically because of something David Chun told me." Marina looked over at David, who was standing with a group of other graduates, but watching her conversation with Rebecca with obvious concern. "David told me that you were the medic who tried to save Michael's life after the convoy was attacked," Rebecca continued. "He said you've been carrying guilt about not being able to do more for him." Marina nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "I need you to know something," Rebecca said, placing a gentle hand on Marina's arm. Michael's letters home were full of respect for the medics who served with his unit. He wrote about how brave they were, how they risked their own lives to save others. He wrote that if anything happened to him, he hoped there would be a medic like you there to try to help him. Tears were streaming down Marina's face now, but she didn't try to hide them. For years, she had imagined conversations with the families of soldiers she hadn't been able to save, always assuming they would blame her for not doing enough. Michael died doing what he chose to do, serving his country and protecting his fellow soldiers, Rebecca continued. The fact that you were there, that you tried to save him, that you've carried his memory with you all these years, that means everything to our family. "I should have been able to do more," Marina whispered. "You did everything you could under impossible circumstances," Rebecca replied firmly. "And more than that, you've honored Michael's memory by helping other veterans find their way back to meaningful lives. David told me about how you've helped him and the others in your program. He said you taught them that the best way to honor fallen comrades is by becoming the kind of veterans those soldiers would be proud of. Rebecca reached into her purse and pulled out a small photograph. It showed a young soldier in full combat gear, standing beside an armored vehicle in a dusty landscape that Marina recognized as Afghanistan. "I want you to have this," Rebecca said, pressing the photograph into Marina's hands. "Michael would want you to know that your service mattered, that your efforts to save him mattered, and that your work helping other veterans matters." Marina stared at the photograph through her tears, seeing Johnson's confident smile and remembering the dedicated squad leader who had been respected by everyone in his unit. Holding this tangible connection to him felt like a form of closure she hadn't known she needed. "Thank you," she managed to say. "This means more to me than you know." As Rebecca Johnson moved away to continue conversations with other veterans and staff members, Marina found herself standing alone by the windows, still holding Johnson's photograph. David approached quietly and stood beside her, both of them looking out at the peaceful forest beyond. "How do you feel?" David asked. "Like a circle just closed," Marina replied. "Like a part of my healing that I didn't even know was incomplete just found its resolution." David nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "Mrs. Johnson asked me to tell her about the peer counseling program. She's interested in getting involved, maybe working with Gold Star families who have veterans dealing with survivor guilt." Marina looked at him in surprise. "Really?" She said that if her son's death could somehow contribute to helping other veterans heal and find purpose, then his sacrifice would have even greater meaning. They stood together in comfortable silence, two veterans who had found their way back from the edge of despair and were now dedicated to helping others make the same journey. Outside, the sun was setting behind the pine trees, casting long shadows across the facility grounds. "Marina," David said eventually, "I've been thinking about something you said during one of our early sessions." "What's that?" "You said that survival was its own form of heroism, that choosing to heal and serve was perhaps the greatest victory any veteran could achieve." Marina nodded, remembering the conversation. "I think you were right, but I want to add something to that," David continued. "I think the real victory isn't just in our own healing. It's in using our healing to help create a world where other veterans don't have to suffer alone the way we did." Marina smiled, feeling a deep sense of pride in how far David had come and how clearly he now understood his purpose. "I think Johnson and Martinez would approve of that mission." As the evening wound down and